Hello, everyone, and welcome to Perspectivas. My name is Salma Ahmed. I am consultant at UNESCO IESALC, and in today's episode, we will be discussing combating racism in higher education. Let's meet today's guests. Welcome, Professor Daniel Mato and Professor Verene Shepherd. Daniel Mato is a principal researcher, National Council for Scientific and Technical Research, and Director of UNESCO Chair in Higher Education and Indigenous and Afro-descendant Peoples in Latin America, Universidad Nacional de 3 de Febrero in Argentina. Verene Shepherd is Professor Emerita of Social History and Director of the Center for Reparation Research at the University of the West Indies. She's vice chair at the CARICOM Reparation Commission and was recently elected chair at the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination at the UN. So, congratulations for that, Vereen. Let's just jump right into it. So, Daniel, could you please briefly define racism for us and explain how it affects higher education institutions and how it's reproduced by higher education institutions?
Thank you. Racism, we could say, is the founding ideology and regime of power constitutive of the modern world. As an ideology, it rests on the assumption that human beings would be classifiable into races and that some of them would be superior to others. In Latin America, this ideology and regime of power date back to the colonial period, but they are also constitutive of the establishment of post colonial republican states continue in force, and their consequences primarily affect persons and communities of African descent and indigenous people. Hegemonic social groups have legitimized their dominance through racist, cultural, and educational policies. They have been so successful in this regard that racism is currently so naturalized in these societies that most of the population often limits the usage of the concept of racism to explicit facts of racial discrimination, and particularly concerning those of police brutality, those very evident, let's say. Higher education systems and institutions, not only institutions, systems, have not been alien to the reproduction and naturalization of racism worldwide. They have played several significant roles in this regard. I would mention just three. In practice, most of them have jeopardized these people's access to higher education and the quality and success of the trajectories of those who manage to gain access. Several naturalized mechanisms have been instrumental in this regard, such as economic barriers, distant locations, monolingual education, and the absence of or insufficiencies of reparatory or also so named affirmative action programs. Concurrently, they have excluded Afro-descendant and indigenous peoples' world visions, histories, languages, and knowledge and learning systems from the curricula, or even present them as backward or openly invalid. In addition, they have monoculturally trained professionals in every discipline. As a result of this biased training, most of these professionals reproduce racism in their professional practices, including teachers throughout the entire educational systems, journalists, historians, sociologists, physicians and nurses, and economists, among others. And the COVID pandemic made more than evident the limitations that this monocultural training impose on their practices. This is something we have to be very careful about, and is a reason to transform higher education systems and institutions worldwide. This is as I see it.
Thank you, Professor Daniel. I think that's a very good point because I don't think a lot of people realize that this also is included as a part of racism. So, Professor Verene, how does higher education institutes support the struggle to combat racism? Do you have any examples or stories to share to our listeners?
Thank you for that question. And yes, I do have a specific example from the University of the West Indies. I am a graduate of the University of the West Indies on the Mona campus, but of course, we have other campuses. And the University of the West Indies is located in a region that was colonized. Because of that, the education that we inherited was a colonial education. And the ideologies, the examples, the poetry, the history, all contained unfamiliar narratives. In other words, not reflective of our reality in the Caribbean. Therefore, since the establishment of history departments in the University of the West Indies, and especially once our academics were trained locally, they began to adopt an anti colonial posture. And so the content of education, not just in history, in geography, in science, in social, all the social sciences and even the medical sciences, they had to, in a sense, indigenize the curriculum and decolonize the curriculum because we inherited ideologies that were racist. We know about Thomas Carlyle, we know about Ruskin, and all the poets and philosophers and artists whose gaze would not have been anti-colonial. So universities have a responsibility if they are located in post-colonial spaces, and if they have had that experience that I described, to decolonize the curriculum, because decolonizing the curriculum will help to address the evils of racism. So that's a practical example I can provide. If you want more practical examples, I
Yeah.
can give an example, for example, of how emancipation was taught.
Yes.
The British colonized Caribbean achieved emancipation in 1834, the full free, as we say, in 1838. The narrative, if you are in the UK, if you were educated in the UK, or if you were reading only books published by UK authors, you would hear about Wilberforce and Clarkson and others, because abolitionists were defined as those humanitarians and parliamentarians in the UK. We had to revise that kind of narrative to say, hey, wait a minute. But without the pressure from the Caribbean by anti colonial activists, including the enslaved people themselves, the pressure would not have reached the level that would force Britain to pass legislation to end the trafficking and to end slavery. So that's an example of how we had to rewrite the history in order to ensure that our students and our people would venerate and celebrate the icons of emancipation who, with boots on the ground, helped in the emancipation movement. And if you, even outside the CARICOM region, the British colonized region, we think of Haiti and their heroes and heroines, Boukman Dutty, Toussaint Louverture, Dessalines. So we have to we have to be intentional in decolonizing the textbooks that we use to teach our children, so that we can use the new knowledge, the revisionist knowledge, as a way of helping to combat racist thought and the belief that our region created nothing. So that's really what we have been doing. We're ensuring that our academics, many trained in the Caribbean, as I said before, are writing the text and decolonizing thought. That's very important.
I agree with you on that. Thank you for elaborating on that question,
I would,
Verene.
I, I would like to add something, if I may.
Yes, please.
I fully agree with all what Viren has told us. And there are many similarities between the history of the mainly English and French speaking Caribbean and the mainly Portuguese and Spanish speaking countries of so called Latin America. Although these of Spanish or Portuguese speaking shade the fact of the indigenous languages. So, as I said, Spanish and Portuguese speaking countries is a way to say because we have hundreds of indigenous languages in so called Latin American countries, which is, by the way, an inconvenient denomination because Latin is not what Afro-descendant and indigenous peoples are. But leaving aside that debate, I agree with Virin. We need to decolonize, but I would be perhaps more emphatic. I think we have to decolonize higher education, but moreover, we have to make it in our countries explicitly anti-racist. And now I'm remembering a phrase that once the well-known Angela Davis, the American or U.S. Uh, activist, said that is in racist societies is not enough not being racist. We have to be anti-racist. And then what I want to say is we need higher education to be free of racism, and to get this, we have to do it for a period, for a long period, probably, for a very long period. We have to have anti-racist policies, anti-racist curriculum. It's not just to leave aside the colonial or the imperial references, or in our cases, I mean, mainly Latin American countries, the narratives of the hegemonic social groups who are mainly the inheritors of the colonial powers, but we have to go explicitly reviewing all that legacy and to deactivate it. So we need to eradicate racism and to practice an anti-racist higher education. And as Verene said, it's not just a matter of history, and in our case, it's not just a matter of languages. We need to place in our universities the indigenous people's languages in the place they have to be, not just in the shades, uh, but also it's a matter of health systems, agricultural practices, the manage of the environment. There are knowledge in several realms. In economics, which have been naturalized, we have to manage in the way the Western hegemony has imposed to the whole planet, with the consequences on our lives and on the planet itself. So I think we need to eradicate racism, and we need to practice an anti-racist higher education. And this is critically important because higher education educate the teachers for the whole education system and educate the professionals who are going to take critically important decisions for whole pluricultural societies but have been monoculturally trained.
Yeah, if you'd allow me, there's so much in what Daniel just said. Um, we have to. I agree, an anti-racist posture must be taken at all levels and in all disciplines, and also among the policymakers, because it has to be reinforced at all levels. Now, we have to, it might sound simple, but we have to teach people how to recognize racism because some of the things are so entrenched in our society that we have to explain how you recognize racism. I had to smile when you said that the denomination, the name you call your country or your region is an inconvenient denomination. And I think of the West Indies because the term West Indies is really wrong. It's the colonizers, the Colombian mission that lost its way and thought they had reached the East Indies. And when they realized not, when they actually reached the East Indies. So our region, which is the Caribbean, which is not even a proper name either, because the Kalinago people, the indigenous people, were called Caribs and therefore Caribbean. So the whole, you know, description and the names given, they are also wrong. But when you try to say, let's go back to the indigenous name, then you have opposition to people who are saying it's too long. I think of Dominica, which is Waitukubuli. And then they are saying, well, go back to that because Dominica comes from Domingo, which is Sunday, because Columbus landed there on that day. So much of even where we live is problematic in terms of the description. And then your reference to the language is so critical in our case, where because of pro-colonial thought and I suppose, the kind of veneration of the English language, the idea of our nation language is denigrated, and children are discouraged from speaking a language that we initiated, we established. So that the racism and it's also classism, that's very strong, also. And we have to start with the little ones because we have to attack every generation. We have to teach every generation because after a while, they forget. So I think you're right. It's a constant re-education that has to take place.
Thank you for that to the both of you.
Uh, I want to say I fully agree with everything Verene has said. Thank you very much.
No, thank you. Thank you to the both of you. Um, Continuing on, Daniel, in your work, you stress the importance of interculturality as a mission for higher education. Could you tell us about how you understand this and what higher education institutes can do to become more intercultural?
Yes, thank you. And in fact, this is strongly connected with what we are discussing uh, because the need to interculturalize higher education is strongly linked to the idea of anti-racist education or anti-white supremacism or Western supremacist higher education. That supremacism, that hegemony has been absolutely naturalized. We think our higher education systems are just normal, just as they have to say, and there is nothing to think or question about. And I think there is a lot. And I think we need to interculturalize higher education, not only because it is a matter of justice, it is also a matter of quality of higher education cannot be quality a higher education that is just monocultural in societies that are pluricultural. The COVID pandemic made evident the limitations of monoculturally trained health professionals to respond appropriately to the challenges intrinsic to the socio-cultural diversity of our societies. Our societies means every society in the world. In fact, these limitations show it to be even more significant anyway at the time to work with indigenous peoples communities who speak other languages and who have other systems of thought, beliefs, other practices in health, in nutrition, in daily life. Moreover, and because of these differences, some mistakes in the responses were also a consequence of the limitations of the monoculturally trained professionals of other fields, not just health, who designed specific policies that did not work. These problems are observable daily in numerous fields, such as economic policies, social development policies, agricultural policies, and of course, in the ongoing environmental disaster caused by the hegemonic monocultural vision of the idea of progress, or rather said, well being. These problems, in particular, indicate the limitations of the monocultural education provided by higher education systems and institutions worldwide. Is not just a matter of Latin America or the Caribbean or both. It is nonsense that higher education, monoculturally trained professionals who should be appropriately prepared to be helpful in societies that are socioculturally complex and remarkably diverse. We have to wonder whether the monocultural training of professionals could be considered quality education. In Latin America, many voices are already critically thinking about these problems, not only myself, and also about the need to interculturalize higher education. Just as an example, the final declaration of the 28 and 2018 Latin American and the Caribbean regional conferences of higher education, both convened to, to feed the world conferences, but the final declarations of these regional conferences included a critical statement in this regard. Both of them stated, more or less, the challenge is not just to include Afro-descendant and Indigenous peoples students in higher education institutions, as they currently are, but to transform these institutions to ensure the incorporation of these peoples' worldviews, languages, knowledge systems, forms of learning, and mode of knowledge production of what other people name epistemologies. This is what we, included myself, mean by intercultural higher education. And I think this is the path we should follow. This is what we have to work for, not only in Latin America and the Caribbean, but worldwide. And I think UNESCO have an important responsibility to ensure this is the path higher education worldwide should follow. This is a pluricultural world. Each of other societies are pluricultural. Higher education cannot be just monocultural and monolingual as it is in each country.
Thank you, Daniel. I think it's very important what you're saying that it's impossible to work for a group of people without working with them. Vereen, you have been involved with many committees in and relating to higher education, doing work to fight against racism. So, As an experienced professional, what advice do you have for people in higher education to work towards making their communities better?
Well, I think we have discussed a lot of the strategies already, but because I am the chair of the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, I would also encourage higher education institutions to pay attention to what is happening on the international level among human rights activists and human rights treaty bodies to ensure that they hold their countries, their states accountable. Many of these states have signed on to become states parties. I'm going to answer as someone who is involved with a treaty body at the UN. This is the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. I think I think that we get caught up in our national issues, and sometimes we forget that we can use international bodies as our allies as we struggle with internal national issues. So, at the level of higher education institutions, I think that staff members, some of them who have become, in Walter Rodney's terms, revolutionary academics, should hold their states responsible. Many of our countries are states parties to international conventions, certainly to the International Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. These treaty bodies can be allies in our national work. My advice is to ensure that when a state party comes before these treaty bodies, NGOs, civil society organizations, academics get involved in tracking the interactive dialogue and also sending what we call alternate reports so that the international community will have a balanced view of what is really taking place on the ground. I'll give you an example. In many of our countries, there is a reluctance to recognize the rights of indigenous peoples and uh, a reluctance to implement the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Many of us are not even aware of the clauses of the Declaration. And I think this is what higher education institutions can do: become activists for the cause of human rights and ensure that states take recognition of international instruments that can assist in helping indigenous communities that are marginalized in some places to enforce their rights. And I also want to say that this, I think Daniel mentioned it, the way in which we have to also, so I'm leaving that issue of the international scene to come back to something that Daniel said, because I think it's so important to reinforce that we have to look at roots and we have to look at how roots denied a recognition of roots. So ROUTES, in terms of the transatlantic trafficking, for example, disrupted our knowledge of our OOTS in terms of cultural heritage. And we have to, as he said, look at the philosophies, the epistemologies that predated or influenced our own culture, and higher education institutions are well placed to do that in terms of, for example, in the case of many parts of the Caribbean and Latin America, the African philosophies, cultures, because the transatlantic trafficking disrupted that culture. And so we have to ensure that we don't imprison ourselves within the walls of academia, but that we enforce cultural heritage at all levels as long as we're able, and as long as we, I suppose, structure our time between teaching in these institutions formally and also going out into the community. And but going back to the international community now, The Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination has adopted a general recommendation which is aimed at preventing and combating racial profiling by law enforcement officials. Certainly, that should be used in higher education institutions, in the law school, for example, you know, in political science, because higher educational institutions have partnerships with government and we can help in the fight against racism and racial discrimination by attacking racial profiling. You mentioned in when we started the whole Black Lives Matter, George Floyd, and so we have to ensure that we work on racial profiling. It's a scourge, and it affects even those of us who are human rights defenders. Everybody who has to pass through immigration, we all have our stories. So even as practitioners and those who are helping to revise the curriculum and so on, and to press for human rights, we also face discrimination. The final thing I want to say is that I think we have a responsibility as professors and those who interact with higher education institutions to interrogate our landscape. And again, I'm going back to your reference to George Floyd and the globalization of the Black Lives Matter campaign. Many of us are walking past icons so we are busy teaching and calling for decolonial justice in the curriculum. But we are walking past statues and icons that don't bring any self-respect to our people. We have to also be involved in that aspect of iconographic decolonization and ensure that the icons we have around us represent us. Everyone knows that there's a call for taking down the statues of Columbus, Christopher Columbus, wherever they are. For some reason, many of us are not able to influence the various ministries to do that. But I recently, you may have heard about the situation at the University of Cambridge, where one of the colleges tried to appeal to the Church of England because the chapel is controlled by the Church of England to take down a plaque to someone who was an investor and perhaps a director also at some point in the Royal African Company. The college was taken to ecclesiastical court for their activism around this and lost the case. The Church of England said Tobias Rostad must remain in the chapel. So the college is considering what is the next step because many people have stopped going to that chapel. They don't feel comfortable, especially black students, to have to be in a space where you have someone who did such harm to their ancestors. So I say that universities are beginning to look on their landscape and to question who are these icons. And we have a responsibility to provide the justification for those questions and the new push towards interrogating the landscape.
Thank you for that, Verene. That's a very good point. We're not only talking about statues, we're talking about holidays, we're talking about a lot of important symbolism in many of our cultures and societies that get a second glance. um, I'm going to give the floor to the both of you if there's anything else you want to add before we finish off. Is there? No?
Thank you. I very much agree with all Virin has said. And I don't know if this could be politically correct to be said, but I think it's not only a matter of chapels, buildings, statues, but I think that the contemporary world has adapted to itself to discuss deeply the role of European crowns who still are alive and in power. Perhaps this is not very politically correct to be said in a podcast to UNESCO because these countries are also members of the United Nations system, but we are not going to change the world in the right direction if we cannot take that debate on the table. Uh, the way in which the, let's say, economic advantages of certain states, not necessarily the people of those states, um, those particular crowns is rooted in the history of slavery and exploitation of America, Africa, and certain regions or certain areas of what is now named Oceania and Asia. And this is a discussion that cannot be avoided. It would be, I think, very little promising if we keep the discussion just about the past and not to the present. And it's not a matter, I'm not proposing these people have to be killed or whatever. What I think is that, and I'm very, very, very happy with the policy in the so called West Indies, a very bad name, as we know, of talking of reparation. Reparation is a duty, not of Europe, because Europe has a lot of people who are living in a disastrous condition as many people in the rest of the world. Reparation is a responsibility of the European crowns and states. And I
Sorry.
think, yeah, and I think this is something that had to be put on the table and we have to discuss it. And we have to discuss it at the universities and other higher education institutions, but also in the international organizations, as Verene has said. So it's not just a matter of decolonizing something of the past, but it's a matter of reparation, it's a matter of anti-racism, and not just a matter of words, but of practices. Reparation involves many symbolic gestures, but also involve political and economic responsibilities for those states and those crowns in particular. I don't know, I'm not an expert on reparation. Verene is the specialist here, so perhaps she could, perhaps not, I'm sure she has something to say.
I am so happy you brought up the R word, that R word, that it's like a scare word to so many people. You are correct. And I was very happy to see the former High Commissioner's report, which referred to how the past is connected to the present and how reparation does not only relate to the past, but we stress the right to development, and we really have to push this matter. And I think we should read the Cambridge University report that just came out, as a higher education institution, as a university that has looked into its past and issued a report about what happened in the past, but also their recommendations for implementation of the recommendations that they make to try to make amends. So I think, as Professor Beckles says, the reparatory justice movement is a 21st century movement. It's the greatest movement of the 21st century, and all of us will, in one way or the other, become involved. So we should all read the former High Commissioner's report and the way in which it supports reparatory justice. And recently, the Human Rights Council had a dialogue on colonialism, its legacies, and its impact, which of course had to talk about the right to development because of the extraction of our wealth by colonialists. And in Europe as well, there are communities that are affected because we have migrants living in those communities. And so we have to fix our world. Reparation is a route to peace and reconciliation. So that's how I will end.
Thank you to the both of you for sharing your expertise with us today. We have to start recognizing racism for what it is, and when we look at the state of the world today, we it looks like we can't even agree on what racism is. So, personally, it's I don't even think there's nothing to agree on because it's very straightforward, as you've shown us today. You guys, both of you, have touched upon many important points and thank you for giving us a holistic viewpoint on this issue. Thank you again, and I hope to hear more of you in the future and see you again. Um,
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you for
you
joining us.
very much, Verene and Salma and Luz.